Hello and welcome to the American Watchman Roundtable podcast, and we are back. I'm one of your hosts, Sam Whitfield, and joining me tonight are Joshua Johnson and Dave Icaboni. Adam is gone this week, and I'll let the other two gentlemen introduce themselves, whichever one wants to start us off.
I guess I will go first. Hello again, everybody. I'm Joshua Johnson. I'm a co-founder of American Watchman.
And hey, everybody, I'm Gabe Icaboni, and I'm a co-founder of American Watchman as well.
And it's just the three of us tonight. So tonight's topic, as you might have guessed from the title, is growth, trends, and changes in the U.S. And that could kind of cover a broad spectrum of things. And Gabe and Josh both had some topics that they wanted to bring up kind of relating to this. So I'm going to kind of step aside as the moderator and let Gabe and start us off. Gabe, what do you have for us this evening?
Well, so our topic is specifically touching on fertility rates. And so I was just going to kind of let this be a free-flowing conversation because I know it touches many aspects in the U.S. and not. But for there was what got me on this topic was there was an interesting survey that was done, and this is a twofold survey. The first one was from the Census Bureau that said that whites were a smaller share of the population among newborns or ages 0 to 9 in the years 2016 and 2017. And along with that, when they dug into the data for that cohort, they found that fertility rates, that the natural born fertility rate was actually below replacement level, but that immigration levels actually were allowing the U.S. population to grow. So, I guess my first question with that is, what does this portend for the body politic in the U.S. Regarding our entitlement system, and what does it mean for society and culture at large?
Well, I guess I'll kind of start off. I'm not as knowledgeable on this topic, but I will say the anniversary of Unite the Right is coming up here in just a few weeks. And as we've said multiple times before, we do not condone the views of any white nationalist organizations here at American Watchmen or any ethnic supremacy organizations for that matter. But it is interesting that from what do I have heard on kind of the alt-right stratosphere, they tend to cite this, change in demographic as being negative, and that's kind of in their motivation, for the Unite the Right, thing, and that's kind of what fuels Richard Spencer a lot of the time, and I personally think it's ridiculous, but I do think that, I guess basically what I'm trying to say is if you want to look at how this affects our culture in the most negative way possible and in the most cynical way possible, that certainly is a perspective in terms of negativity. In terms of positive stuff, I would be curious to see how much of this is, race mixing among, perhaps whites and blacks or whites and Hispanics, which you see a lot of here in Florida. So that's just kind of my take on it. Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
To be kind of fair to the people who freak out about these studies, particularly the alt-right folks, the media does present it in a way that almost seems like it's designed to make somebody who is white feel anxious, because the attitude in the articles tends to be crowing, "Ha ha, white America's finally dead." but I'll be the realist or the pessimist or whatever, if you will, here. And I guess I have two things to say to that. First off, I think all of these news stories, I understand it's important to have demographic studies and bean counters and census takers doing this stuff because they need a job, and the data is interesting and sometimes can tell us a lot about politics. But overall, I think the way the media handles these demographic change stories is just a big waste of time, particularly when it comes to race, because that's immaterial in my view. But second, though, I would say that I don't think, even having said that I think it's a waste of time, I would also go add to that saying I don't think that this really means anything in a meaningful demographic change way, because as we were talking about before we went onto the air a little bit, when it comes to the groups that are growing fastest in the United States, Hispanics and Asian Americans, within about one or two generations, they have intermarried with whites to such a degree that that they identify as white. They assimilate fully, if you will. And when you also factor in the declining fertility rates, not only across the board, but specifically when it comes to minority groups, you see that their fertility rates collapsing faster than the white one is. So the notion that and again, I can't stress enough. I think it's kind of stupid saying whether there will be a white America or not in the first place, because any sane person doesn't see it as white America. I don't think. I think they just see America. I think it's ridiculous that we haven't gotten past the point where we don't see color anymore. But I don't think we're going to see quote unquote white America coming to an end within 50 years, specifically because of the declining fertility rates amongst minorities and the fact that there's so much assimilation going on that within one or two generations, a lot of these people that are being treated as outliers or outsiders or whatever now are going to be no different than the guy next door to you. So,
Joe Rogan, I just kind of want to add real quick on what you were saying. Joe Rogan, I was listening to his podcast, and he's a Joe Rogan. I'm sure many of our listeners, if you listen to podcasts, you pretty much know who Rogan is. But he's a comedian, but he also does lots of social commentary. And he was talking and this was 3 or 4 years ago, about how in 100 years or so, he predicted that the race mixing will be as such that we simply the the vast majority of us are going to probably be mixed into some sort of beige,
well, no, it wouldn't be beige, because when you look at the I forget the term from my high school biology courses, recessive traits. When you look at the traits that are most dominant, if you were to breed everybody over and over again until you had one person, they're probably going to look something like a Mediterranean. They're going to have that kind of Middle Eastern person. But again, though, I don't. I understand that race plays a role in politics. A member of Group X is more likely to vote this way or whatever. But at the core of that is it's not because they're black or white. It is because of the way they have been trained to think about those things. And to me, politics should be more about beliefs. And I understand. I just had a conversation with a liberal woman from New York the other day, and she basically accused. We were discussing abortion specifically, and I pointed out to her I'm pro-life because I think one of the greatest social injustices there is abortion. And I added to that point because aborted babies tend to be from poor backgrounds, or they tend to be from minority backgrounds. Rich white women don't have to worry about getting abortions typically. And she just sort of laughed it off, being the pro-choice person she is, and said, "Oh, you just don't understand how race is a factor in belief systems, and how it's a very white thing to be against abortion." And it just floored me, because I understand that there is a racial there's a racial factor in politics. I just don't think there should be, because the color of your skin shouldn't matter. Your ideas and your beliefs should matter.
Well, I think to your point, Josh, a lot of the conversation around this topic and why it so pertains to race is because the way the Census Bureau categorizes race is basically Hispanic and non-Hispanic. Those are really, or in terms of ethnicity, I should say, instead of race, there are only two ethnicities recognized in the U.S., Hispanic and non-Hispanic. Now, we all know that there are obviously a lot more ethnicities than two in the U.S., but that I think tends to be why the conversation gets brought back to race as opposed to ethnicity. In terms of the fewer native-born Americans having kids versus the growth rate in the U.S. being because of immigrants coming into the country, I think the conversation is less about race, especially considering our politics now, and more about how is it going to shape America as a culture and a society going forward. It's true that immigrants in a couple generations, depending on where they come from, will assimilate into American culture, but they will also assimilate their culture into the fabric of all the other cultures that make up the U.S. So I think the concern, I don't know exactly what the concern is with the alt-right, but the question is, how will that play into our culture now, and how will it shape it going forward? Because the saying is true that America is a melting pot. And a melting pot can imply two things. It means you either have a dominant culture that accepts the other cultures that come in, or the smaller cultures ultimately change the dominant culture.
That's a better conversation. That's a conversation I think we should be having. And I think that's really what a lot of this is about. I think the media paints it as race, but the underlying thing is what's the culture going to be. And right. I don't think a lot of people, because a majority of Trump supporters, the way they make it sound is like every Trump supporter or every Republican or whatever hates somebody who's non-white. Not at all. There are a lot of Trump supporters who are non-white. There are a lot of Republican Trump supporters who are white and who don't care what your skin color is. I'm one of them. Right. And make no mistake, our listeners who have been listening thus far, even though I have said that immigrants will assimilate, that don't get me wrong, I'm not for open borders. Specifically because of cultural reasons. I don't believe that a majority of our population should be born outside of this country, for example. But I think that the way the media presents it with race as a factor, it sort of muddies the waters in terms of what we actually end up talking about. Right. And it's just a tactic, of course. They use language to try and shift things in their way and make it look like everybody on the other side's racist or whatever. But
right.
I certainly think that you're absolutely right. This is something that Michael Savage talks about a lot on his radio show too, is border language and culture. Notice that and that's become a pretty common mantra as well among most Trump supporters and most people on the new right, kind of this conservative / libertarian, sphere that we've kind of put ourselves into in the past few years. Notice that race isn't really a part of that, but it's more of which culture do you want to embrace? Do we want to embrace Western democracy, which has given us so much? And then, which parts of Eastern culture do we want to embrace? And then which negative parts of the culture do we want to, banish and get rid of? And that's really the discussion that we're, I think faced with on the larger front as a whole, and then there are some, extremists out there that obviously want to make it all about race.
I think a lot of it too, and I sort of touched on this with you guys right before we got into it, is that mass immigration, it's not just the cultural aspects, but there are definitely economic aspects as well. Having a constant inflow of cheap labor has made it very difficult for the poorest people in society to not only find work, but to just go ahead and make ends meet when they're constantly having to compete with people whose wages are artificially suppressed and they can't compete with them.
Yeah, and I mean the flip side of that cheap labor, because everyone talks about it, and this is kind of like a neocon economic, talking point, is they say, well, cheap labor is better for the entrepreneur because they can produce more at a higher cost. But my argument to that is, well, okay, if you use cheap labor to make products en masse, then more often than not, you're going to get, cheap labor equals cheap product, which equals, a crap product.
Well,
So, and I know this has kind of become a, stereotype of American made. Uh, that's kind of become like an old folksy term, but it really is. I think there really is something to be said for, American manufacturers making American things. Yeah, it may cost a little more than cheap labor,
well,
but
here's the thing though. The manufacturing jobs you're talking about, those have been exported overseas, so they're being done by foreigners. But that's not the cheap source of labor I'm talking about coming in. What I'm more referring to is you see, for example, lots of manual agricultural jobs around here in Nebraska, for example. And the question becomes, you noted that the product might be as good, but to me, the question is even before that: is do we want to be a country that treats people that way, that has people doing backbreaking manual labor, whether they're our own people or not, backbreaking manual labor for little to no pay? Do we want to basically be involved in what amounts to a 21st century version of the slave trade, where we're trafficking people into our country and sometimes doing that by destroying their original home countries, as we've done in the Middle East and Syria particularly, in order to get them to come up here and do work for us? Or in Europe, for example, that's more where you get into Syria, because the NATO arming of terrorists in Syria has led directly to the refugee crisis, which has greatly benefited these big corporations that get to have all these cheap refugee migrant laborers pouring into Europe.
Well,
yeah.
and I think that that ties into another point about what is the social cost to society in terms of the immigration patterns, and the growth rate in the U.S. I mean, because right now, for example, for our immigration system, it's not based off, what's the term I'm searching for? It's not a merit-based system. It's based off, do you have family in the U.S.? So there are very real costs to allowing immigrants to come into the country who don't necessarily have the skills to immediately find jobs, beyond manual labor. And there are also costs to the government in terms of providing them services. If you don't speak a language, the U.S. language, but you're entitled to a public education, then the schools have to adapt to it. I mean, you kind of have seen this with the border crisis, especially for Texas, where the state was completely unprepared for the border crisis, and you had an influx of immigrants coming into all these border communities, and the schools, for example, and the health officials in these communities were all overwhelmed because these people didn't speak the language. The employees at those places didn't have the skills to interact with these individuals on a level that would allow these individuals to learn or to actually get the basic care that they needed. So there is a social cost, and there's also a financial cost to this, unless you modify the system somehow to mitigate those.
Well, and
I would just add on that, when I was actually growing up, my mother worked at a Burger King for a little while as a cashier. And the cooks in the back, both of whom, I don't know if they were legal or illegal, but both of the cooks in the back, neither of them could speak English. So you can imagine how stressful that was, both for her and for the customers, trying to get your order into the cook who has absolutely no clue what you're telling them to do. But
well, and the other thing too, Josh, kind of tagging on to what both you and Gabe were saying. Uh, I remember when I was growing up in elementary school, and really this was the case. It didn't really happen so much in high school, at least not that I knew about. Although I'm sure it did happen to a lesser extent. But in terms of the schools being overwhelmed, I can remember in elementary and middle school overhearing teachers talking how overwhelmed the how overfilled the ESL program, the English second language program, is because they had just this big mass of students coming in, and that was just in one school. That was in my school, which was fairly well to do and had a lot more money than perhaps Denver public schools or some poor school districts. And I have nothing against ESL programs when they're tailored to the proper amount of students and stuff like that. But this, when you're getting an overflow of immigrants, it doesn't help them, and it doesn't help the people in America even who want to help them either. So
I'm gonna kind of pivot to the more domestic aspect. Not I shouldn't have maybe said domestic, but the non-immigration aspect of this fertility crisis. But it does sort of tie into immigration because I've said this for a while now, with particular regards to Muslim migrants that come to the United States. But we are the fertility crisis is that people aren't having children as early as they used to. Some of them are waiting so long that they get to the point where they can't have children.
Right.
They're infertile. But anyways, that is the reason that's there's a cultural reason for that. And I want to ask you guys about that. But tying it into immigration a little bit, I've often said the reason we're struggling with assimilating some people is because, saying this as a very religious Catholic myself, if you came to the United States right now and you turned on a television and saw what our culture looked like, would you, and you're a very religious person, would you even want to assimilate? And that's what I think a lot of people should take into consideration with the Muslim community that we've brought in, is because if you came from a very religious country, would you want your kids to be like what they've seen in the United States? Especially when our culture as it is right now seems to be putting the self and the career and hedonism before family, before community, before everything else, leading to this fertility crisis where people are having kids for so long that it gets to the point they can't have kids in some cases.
Well, and this goes into something that I've talked a lot about on the Whitfield Report, my cast, where I talk a lot about culture and popular culture and how Hollywood and all that stuff kind of intermingles with politics. The big problem that we have culturally is that we have Hollywood, which is a very small, elitist portion of the country, basically putting out the vast majority of the media for the United States and for much of the world. And so the image that they put out is the image that a lot of foreigners get of America. And Nick DiPaolo, the comedian I like, he has a bit where he actually says, "Yeah, he jokingly says, when you look at TV shows like the Kardashians and other things, yeah, ISIS kind of does have a point about hating our guts just because of the moral corruption over here." And I don't want to get too much into that, but getting back to the lack of procreation. I think in terms of that, what we have going on there is twofold. We have all of these migrants coming in, but then we also have people over here who aren't getting married and procreating. Then there's a third element, which I think I've shared with you my story, where you have a whole bunch of leftists on college campuses telling mostly male students, oh, it's not a good idea to breed because males are inherently rapists and utter nonsense like that. So, which scares the vast majority of young men. So,
I think it's interesting that you bring up Hollywood in relation to the culture, because I believe it was Oscar Wilde who said that life imitates art far more than art imitates life. And I'll cite one example. I don't have the magazine anymore, and I wish I did because I would like to actually quote the numbers. But when I was growing up, before I became Catholic, I came from an evangelical family, and so we always got the Trumpet magazine. And they had a really good article one time on Hollywood, on movies, on the depiction of drugs in movies, whether or not drugs were portrayed in a positive way or a negative way, sort of like in The Hangover, where everybody's smoking dope and partying with drugs. But they had a graph. It was a chart with some graphs with some. I forget the type of chart the actual term for, it, but anyways, it showed year by year the number of times drugs were shown positively in movies, and it began ticking up consistently year after year, starting around the mid 1970s. And at first it was only like 10 or 15 movies a year, and then by the time it got to 2008, we had almost over 200 movies that showed drugs in a positive manner, and that's not even counting what we got into in the 2010s. I know personally when I go to watch a comedy anymore, it's very hard to find something that's not so incredibly vulgar I don't feel comfortable watching it with my family. Um, but yeah, it's definitely. I think that's a really great point you raised, Sam, because what you are, what you eat, and I think that what people see on the television and what they're reading definitely has an impact on how they live their lives.
Now, I mean that's not to say that, like I'll admit that, I like to watch comedies and some of these action movies and some of these escapist things myself, from time to time in my own time. I'm actually a film critic on my own blog, so I enjoy that type of stuff. I enjoy the escapism, but at the same time, I don't live my life, exactly that way. And I think that there are a lot of Americans, who do fit into that same boat. You and
Yeah,
I would.
don't get me wrong. Yeah, I'm not being like I'm not like the guy who goes and blames video games for some kid going and shooting up a school, because I've played my fair share of shoot 'em up games when I was younger, and I've watched my
Oh,
fair share of comedies
oh no, no,
that are bad, and I've not done it. I think
right.
there is an impact. I'm not blaming it entirely. Let's put it that way.
Well, so switching away from Hollywood for a second, because I think that the impact of Hollywood is it definitely has a cultural impact, but I think there's been pushback against Hollywood in general. Do you guys see, generally a lack of support for people actually starting families? I know, for example, and I mean, speaking specifically of the domestic front, there are many examples on the international front of government policies that support families. But in the U.S., one of the individuals who's been really pushing it, he pushed it in the tax overhaul, was Marco Rubio, who specifically has been clear as a Republican that government should do more to support families. So, do either of you guys kind of see in the U.S. the lack of support for families, whether it's a financial incentive to have kids, whether it is the lack of paid leave for families in terms of work? Do you see that having an impact on fertility rates within the U.S.?
I
I
I mean I do know of the thing that you're speaking with in regards to Marco Rubio. I haven't done too much research into that, but I have read a little bit on that. As far as the lack of support financially for families, it's interesting that you bring that up because a friend of mine who lives back in Denver, he works out at the airport, and he was telling me that one of his coworkers who just became a father uh, took some time off uh, for paternity leave, and he thought that, from my understanding, and I'm getting this story, secondhand, but from my understanding, the guy took off and for paternity leave, and was told that he was going to get that paid paternity leave to be with his wife to help with the baby. And then when he came back, he did not get that pay. They simply, you know, it was it was time off, but it was unpaid time off for paternity leave, even though they had said that they were going to pay him. That may be just one company, but I mean I've heard stories like that before too here in Florida, and I think that's kind of troubling. I'm not I'm not saying that that's kind of like an anti-family conspiracy, but I certainly I do know that that happened, if that makes sense.
I have four-ish points that I'm going to make on this, and I'm not going to present them in any specific order because this is a really good question. But first, I would say to Sam's point, definitely, I think that within our country, in terms of employers, I definitely think we could improve on creating the kind of atmosphere that is conducive to family over career, or not family over career, but family with career. And in terms of parental leave and things like that, because I know the company I work for doesn't offer that, and it's sort of a catch-22 with specific regards to that. Because if you live in an area of the country where the cost of living is relatively low, like say Nebraska, a lot of the smaller towns are going to be smaller businesses that are not going to have the kind of money to provide you with that. Or if they do, they're not going to feel compelled to do so. And if you go to the big city where you might get that kind of benefit, it's sort of undermined by the fact that the cost of living is so high that you don't really feel like you want to have a child. So that would be the first point. Second point, I would say that I think there is this general. We have a this is my chance to sort of bash on the capitalist mindset or the consumerist mindset or whatever you want to call it here. But we have in the West and the Anglo-speaking world particularly, because I know I've seen a lot of articles on this in the United Kingdom's press, but we have a culture that is very me-centered. It's very, very much centered around the individual instead of around the community. And there's nothing wrong with that to a point, but we have taken it almost starting around in the 1980s, I would say, and onward. We have taken it to its logical extreme, to the point that a lot of people very much, I mean, you see all the time anymore, I do anyway, amongst millennials, comments on social media like, oh, well, there's just no economic incentive for me to have a kid anymore because it used to be that I would have kids to take care of me in my old age. And it's just the totally wrong mentality to have in terms of having a family, because ask your grandma if she had kids because she was thinking about somebody to take care of her in her old age. You will never find a single grandma in history who would actually say that was the reason she did that. But because of the very individual, very market-oriented society we have, you see people actually thinking like that now. So that'd be my second point. Third point, sort of bashing on the Republican Party on this a little bit, and this ties in more to, and I agree fully with what Rubio is saying on this, which is kind of funny because I hate him on everything else almost. But it comes down, this is more of a philosophical, and it does tie into my previous point, but it's a philosophical point for conservatives in America, because government, and I've said this over and over again, government does have a role, but the right in America has gotten so used to thinking in terms of big government versus small government that you get to the point where you have people pushing back. And there was this kind of pushback against Rubio at the time, saying that no, the government shouldn't be involved in the bedroom like that. We can't be picking winners and losers. We can't be doing that. This very libertarian, again, very individualist, market-oriented kind of mindset. But at the same time, if you're going to take that approach, then don't complain to me later on about the social costs of declining fertility. And to that point, also sort of again tying into it, there is, I would say, this corrosive aspect to the market, or at least the way the elites want it, because and maybe Gabe's going to disagree with me on this, but as I see it, the financial elite in our society do everything they can to try and undercut the social safety net. And this is a perfect way to eventually get rid of Social Security. It's a way to say, oh, well, we can't fund it anymore. We better start privatizing the program. We better start transitioning to private savings accounts or whatever. It's sort of conservatives are always fond of saying that Obamacare was always a conspiracy to get to universal health care. That may or may not have been true. But I would say, well, if that's happening with Obamacare, then on the right you have a cultural our cultural elites creating the kind of environment that will later allow them to try and privatize or get rid of Social Security by creating a crisis where it's not being funded anymore. I pray that we never get to that point, but that's sadly where it seems like we're going if the fertility crisis continues. And I've gone on so long that I almost forgot what my fourth point is. But I think I've gone on long enough, so I'll turn it over to Gabe or Sam now.
Um, Gabe, if you don't mind, I would just like to jump in here. Just two kind of quick points, or I'll try and make them quickish. It's interesting, Josh, what you said earlier about kind of like the me mentality of our culture. I certainly agree with you that we do have a me-centered society. Ironically, though, I also think it's very interesting that despite the fact that we have a me-centered society and kind of an individual society, we are also a society that is heavily medicated on antidepressants and other sorts of behavior modifying pills.
But Sam, if I can slightly interrupt you for a minute, why are the people on the antidepressants? It's because our society, because of how in the modern sense anyway, our society is so me-centered. It's so individualistic that we have a lot of people who are very lonely now, very depressed. We have a depression epidemic. And the book, I think it came out in 2005, and I wish they'd write a sequel to it. But because this was before social media even came along and made the problem even worse in some respects, which is ironic considering that since we're all connected, you'd think people wouldn't be lonely, but they are. And it was called Bowling Alone. And it talked about the downfall of communities as the individual became more prominent in our society and how that ties into depression.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that. I actually seem to remember reading excerpts of that for a psychology class I took my senior year of high school. And yeah, it is kind of interesting because we're such an individualistic society, yet the individual feels so alone and so depressed, and they don't. The funny thing is, and I don't. This might not make much grammatical sense, but we become such an individualistic society that the individual does not feel like an individual at all. If that makes any
Well,
sense.
I perfectly get what you're saying because I sent this article to Gabe a while ago. I can't remember what it was called, but it basically described the life of the average American worker. They come home in the evening. They don't go out with their buddies. They don't go to the Elk Lodge. They don't go bowling. They don't go to a restaurant. They come home and they sit in front of a little glowing box that has been marketed to them saying it's going to make them happy. And now not only does it not make them happy, but they turn on the box and they see that their bosses have followed them home, so to speak, and are now lecturing them on how bad they are for having a steak for dinner or for having a particular religious belief that doesn't fit with the popular elite conception of the day, or the elite attitude of the day, cultural attitude of the day.
Well, but I guess I'm going to jump in here and
Sure, go ahead.
Play the devil's advocate. America has always been an individualistic society, yet we didn't have this problem but before. So there has to be something here more than just. I'm going to disagree with you a little bit, Josh. I think you're throwing a little bit too much of the blame on a corporatist, individualistic mindset, because I think there's been a reemergence of community, especially in urban areas, and ironically, those are generally the progressive areas of the U.S. So I mean I kind of see what you guys are saying, but I'm not fully maybe as far as you are there, Josh, or where you are, Sam.
Well,
I'm not saying that all individualism is bad. I would say that the problem began to get really bad in the 1980s because that's when our culture and our society under Ronald Reagan, who I am one of the few Republicans probably not be a fan of for obvious reasons. But during that time period, we began seeing the modern neoliberal consensus emerge, and that impacts every aspect of society, and particularly with respect to individual versus community. That's where we began to see this sort of me, got to make as much money as I can, got to build my career as much. as I can mentalities sort of start to come in. That's not to say that individualism didn't exist before. It's just that it was a yin and a yang kind of thing where it was tempered
Well, I mean,
a bit by.
Does it, and so I guess where I sort of agree with that, and I guess this is looping us back to the original point, is that do immigration patterns play a part in that? Because we all know simple human nature is, for example, if you're at a party and there are 100 people in the room and you see two people, who are you going to go to? You aren't going to go to the complete strangers in the room. You're going to go to the two people you know. And in that same kind of dynamic, communities are going to self-sort themselves, so you go to people you know, or you go to the same ethnicity as you, or the same race. And in the 50s and 60s and 70s and even the 80s, we were a fairly more mono-ethnic, mono-racial society. So what I think that is playing a role in this as well, where even though America is a melting pot, we celebrate diversity. We're not necessarily recognizing the subtle impacts of a diverse and changing society, and how it does interplay with growth patterns, and in terms of people having families, because you have all these factors interacting with each other in really hard in ways that are really hard to quantify.
but see, Gabe, the fact that you're going to the person that you immediately know of, at the party, and because you have friends that are of your own, ethnicity, and that you're hanging out with them, that's bigoted and racist and biased, and obviously I'm being facetious. That's one of the major liberal talking points. I mean, look, I earlier in the show I condemned neo-Nazism and ethnic extremism, and on the flip side, I condemn what the left is doing, which is you know enforced diversity, where we kind of force each other to be overly aware of, each other's different ethnicities. I think the big problem, and I'm sure we can kind of all agree on this, is that we have there are basically two extremes, and we used to be kind of in this happy, middle ground, kind of in the 90s and mid 2000s, and now with the culture wars being it seems like we're swinging on two, ends of the pendulum. And Gabe, I did want to ask you, because it seemed like you kind of agreed with Josh and I a little bit on the extreme individualistic thing, but perhaps you disagreed with us on how we got there. So my question to you is, what do you think is causing like a lot of these problems?
Well, I tend to think it is the dominant culture. I mean, for example, I do think you're right, Sam, to some, that it is culture in terms of women being told that a quarter of women are going to be raped on college campuses. So if that's the case as a woman, why would you want to hang out with a guy that you may or may not know? I think that's a pattern. I think that I honestly do think that some of it is a consequence of the push for equal pay, and in terms of equalization of the genders, socially, culturally, economically. I think there's a downside to that that's not being acknowledged, which is that women are putting their careers first. And I wouldn't say that's a bad thing, by any means. I mean, my wife is a teacher. She's a professional, but I think emphasizing that to such a point is actually to the detriment of having children. I mean, if you're going to college and you're waiting till 30, 35 to even contemplate having children, or even contemplating marriage, that is ultimately, in terms of actually fertility rates, a downside to improving fertility rates. So I think that's a factor. I think culture is a factor, and I also do agree with Josh to a point that within especially the GOP, there is kind of this contradiction although there are contradictions in every political party. I mean, it's a political party with many different diverse viewpoints, but that there is a contradiction in terms of wanting to say cut programs or cut the social safety net, while at the same time going, we need to give more tax cuts or tax credits to families. Well, families rely on both those things. So you're basically putting money towards one thing, but not money towards another when they're both ultimately pursuing the same goals.
I would also say from kind of personal experience, being on a college campus myself, and talking to a lot of other people at our age, one of the big concerns, and I know that there is a certain sect of conservatives that kind of mock this and just say, oh, just have kids anyway because we need to procreate. But there is a big concern, and I do think it's legitimate. Um, where the cost of living and the cost of starting a family is, the way that high schools and colleges make out to be, that they make starting a family out to be, very financially costly, which it is. But I think institutions kind of scare millennials who and college kids just in general who quite frankly might not be that well financial off anyway because they're young and they're in college. And
It's not just the colleges or the excuse me, it's not just the colleges or the institutions. I think it's also the wider culture, because I think we've all heard jokes about, oh, well, your life ends when you get married and have kids or whatever. And for a generation that's already sort of been, I don't want to say all millennials are, I don't want to buy into the stereotype because I know that we aren't, but a generation that's sort of been billed as hedonistic, of course, that's going to turn them off when they hear that over and over again in the culture. But I would also say I don't think it's the institution that necessarily needs to scare them into seeing how costly a family is, because they might have seen that growing up on their own. I know this is sort of a little fun trivia fact because I'm a huge Simpsons fan. But in the opening of The Simpsons, they always have the scene in the opening crawl or whatever, like when the theme song or where Marge takes the baby and swipes it across the grocery scanner, and there's an astronomical price. What that price is depending on the year the show was made, the average cost of having a child in that year, and you can watch that thing dramatically go up if you start from an episode that aired in the either the late 80s or the early 90s all the way up to. And not just that, I saw a great point the other day on Twitter that somebody made, and I shared with you guys. A guy who had watched The Simpsons growing up thought they were a lower middle class family, which I think that's what the intention of the creators of the show was, because Homer is supposed to be an average Joe. But what average Joe today lives in a house as big as his, has 2 or 3 cars, has 3 kids, he has a kind of blue collar manufacturing nuclear reactor job. What average Joe has that anymore? The cost of living has just soared so much. And to go back to the racial point, I do think that people sort of self-sort, and to a certain degree, I think that's natural. It becomes bad and racist when it becomes exclusive, an exclusionary kind of thing, like, oh, well, I won't associate with you because you're black or whatever.
Well,
but I would also say, though, that, and this goes into the cost of living we're discussing, is that class tends to be a bigger divider between people than race, because who's going to have more in common, to a black and a white guy who are both struggling to make ends meet, or two rich people of different races, black and white. I would note also, and this sort of ties into what I said earlier about my thinking that abortion is one of the greatest social injustices, is that the family is an institution. You don't see that going away amongst the wealthiest Americans.
no.
I think David French at the National Review commented on this. You have these elite white liberals that tell people that going to church and having kids and all this is bad, but they do that. They have kids, they have families because they can afford to do it still. While a lot of the peons or a lot of the poorer people can't anymore.
Well, Well, going back to my initial point, though, what I was going to say in regards to the economics and whatnot is from my perspective as someone who's attending college and who's interacting with a lot of my peers. I think a lot of them do want to start families. I think a lot of them are just are kind of scared and kind of confused about how to do that because our society doesn't really we kind of have the handbook for hey, if you get pregnant, here's how you can have an abortion, but we don't really we don't teach things like budgeting or paying taxes or really even raising kids. So this whole basically what all I'm trying to say is I think, yeah, there are lots of hedonistic, millennials, but I think that there are also lots of other, millennials out there who do want to start families, but are just daunted by it. You and I know of, a couple individuals that we interact with on Facebook that are like that a lot, Josh.
Well, you
There,
know, I know that everybody picks on baby boomers, so I'm going to briefly pick on them for a little bit.
Yes.
But and it's not just baby boomers because obviously there are millennials that have parents in all the different generations before us. But millennials were sort of raised with this attitude that, oh well, you matter, and of course everybody matters, but you matter to an almost extreme degree. You can do whatever you want, you can have whatever you have, you don't have to make sacrifices. But it doesn't work that way, especially with marriages and children. I know a young woman who recently got married. Well, she didn't recently get married. She got married a year ago, and now it's already ended in divorce. And she's got a 3-month-old baby she's left with. Dad's ran out on her. But you sit and you wonder, and I see it quite a bit amongst the younger people that do get married. But are they receiving proper marital counseling? Are they actually talking like couples should? Or do they go into marriage thinking this will solve all my problems, or this will be a dream, or this will be a fantasy, like in the Disney movies or whatever? When it's not necessarily the walk in the park that a lot of people think in the first few months when they're when they're romancing with their partner before they're getting married. I think Gabe probably is more qualified to talk about that than any of us since he actually is married. But I think millennials particularly, I think part of it is on them, but I also think they've sort of been shortchanged by the generations that came before them who didn't give them a necessarily realistic picture of the world or what needs to be done for families.
I agree. I agree with Josh on that. I don't know. I would actually say it's probably less boomers that gave millennials that expectation, and probably more the millennials' parents and honestly the government. I mean, there was an interesting study that came out of homeowners, and they found the only age group in America who were of working age. So, we're talking 18 and above, and then they break it down by, ages of 9. So 20, 29, 30, 39. Of those age brackets, the only bracket that actually had more renters than homeowners were 20 to 29-year-olds. Now, for those of us who have entered this job market and are millennials, it's not news to us that the job market is tough. And when you graduate college, you don't walk into a 5-figure salary with health insurance and benefits of the wazoo like boomers and prior generations have. I think for younger families especially, there's an affordability aspect to having children and being able to feel financially secure enough to have children. That's a big impediment to people actually having children.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not even touching the aspect of being able to juggle children and your job, especially if your employers expect you to some degree be not necessarily tuned in 24/7, but to be at your desk at 8 and you only get to leave the office at 5.
I would add to that too. Going back, to Gabe mentioned all the benefits that previous generations had coming into the job market that millennials don't. I would add, sort of tying back to our earlier conversation, about whether there's support for families or not at a governmental level. That not only is there that are the employment benefits not there, but there isn't quite as much of a safety net as there used to be anymore for people coming into the job market, for people that are looking at having a family. But that what very little is left of our safety net, so many people are uneducated about. It would blow you away the number of people I have met who are completely in the dark about what few basic things they can do if they fall on hard times. Like there is no, I mean, think about it. When you went through high school and college, nobody educates them on this stuff anymore. They don't know. They don't know what few benefits our government still does have to try and protect them or help them if they fall into hard times. And so that makes it even scarier when they're considering maybe having children. And hey, am I still going to have my job 5 months after my kid is born, or are we still going to have the house or whatever?
Well, I mean, this kind of differs. Differs a little bit, although not much. I mean, I'm learning, about the different benefits I can receive as a person with, physical disabilities, and I'm sure that Gabe, you might know some of that too. And those resources, there are a lot of them, but like you said, the some of those resources are unknown. The other point that I wanted to bring up in regards to why families, this is kind of going back to the question of why aren't we seeing as many families. I think another big part culturally is the D word. And what's the D word I'm referring to? Divorce. Millennials, myself included, many of us have parents who are divorced and who got divorced when we were either children or teens. And, as a result, and I confess, up until about two or 3 years ago, I was kind of in this category as well, up until I talked to my mom about it. But the one thing I always hear from millennials and my friends who have also gone through divorces as children is, well, it's extremely painful, and my parents' divorce was so nasty, and I couldn't bear to put a kid, through what I went through, and with the relationships these days, I'm afraid that would probably happen.
I think that not only is it divorce, and I think that'd be great for when Amina eventually comes onto our program, but I would note, it's often commented upon how we're living in an age of disruption with automation and all the technological changes happening so rapidly. But as you all know, I'm a huge history buff. And when I was in college, I actually wrote an essay on the Gilded Age, comparing it to our own. And it was actually so good that they now use it at my alma mater to teach that particular course. It's an example that the students have to read. But and if I could, I'd probably go back and add some more stuff and rewrite it now from when I first wrote it. But anyways, in the essay, I had compared our age with the Gilded Age, and the comparisons are even more stark now than when I wrote it back in 2014. And it's striking to me that if you look into the history of the human race, when the population began to explode, when did it start to explode? It began to explode after the labor movement began to take off, and after people and workers particularly began fighting for their rights to have protections and benefits. But right now, when you look at the statistics and see how we've regressed, particularly in America, on so many fronts, and you see how we're starting to be back into 1920s levels of income inequality and disparity, to me, I think that part of the reason we're seeing this fertility crisis is because of how the labor movement has been so completely emasculated or whatever you want to call it here in our country. And it's particularly because how much we resemble that Gilded Age again. We have our own version of robber barons in the form of the Silicon Valley executives. We have these new industries that are coming and promoting rapid technological change, but those changes aren't necessarily reaching everybody. The benefits of those changes aren't reaching everybody. The world is becoming a smaller place. I would encourage our listeners, go back and just look into Victorian and Edwardian era history and just read about it. Just read about the lives of an average person and then think about our world today, especially if you're living in America, because the comparisons are much more stark if you're an American than if you're living somewhere else. But I think part of the reason we're seeing this drop in fertility is because of the massive amounts of inequality and the rapid weakening of our safety net. I think definitely plays into it as well, along with the fear of divorce.
Well, so I think that's a component. The question I guess I would have with this is, why are the more educated who have the means to have more children actually having fewer children than those who don't have the means to have children in the first place? I mean, there was an interesting book, and I do apologize, I can't remember who wrote it, of a gentleman who studied specifically white American culture, and he took a hypothetical scenario. I think he labeled the low income white community as Fishtown, and then he labeled the other community something else. And the name of the book is Coming Apart, and it cataloged kind of the white culture or white community from the 1960s to today, or pretty much when the book was written. I think the book was written in the early 2000s. And it specifically found that people in Fishtown who actually couldn't get ahead, they were more likely to have divorce, but they were also more likely to have more children than the families who were less likely to get divorced and more likely to go to college and have successful careers, but they were less likely to have children. So the families that actually can afford to have children right now are the ones who are actually not having children. And so there's an interesting model of this, and I know I've mentioned it in the past in various conversations. And the theory specifically is called demographic transition, where as technology advances, a society will move from a high birth rate and high death rate to actually having low birth rates and low death rates. And there are a lot of theories about why this occurs, and I think there's an interaction in America of these theories. I think it's occurring all over the world, not just in the U.S. When you look at Russia, I mean, Russia is basically Russia's at demographic extinction levels. I mean, by 2050, I think their population is supposed to shrink by a third, and the reason why I bring up Russia in particular is because they have one of the most expansive social safety nets, especially for people to have children in the world, and their people still are not having children.
I guess I'm going to push back a little on that. I'm not sure. I think people are fond of thinking, put it this way, the reason so many Russians, and not just Russians, but you see it across Eastern Europe, particularly in Germany, where they have a term for it. I think it's pronounced nostalgia, or nostalgia for the East, and the reason so many people in Russia and Eastern Europe they're nostalgic for the economic benefits and the social safety net benefits that came with being in the Soviet Union, even if they're not necessarily nostalgic for the political repression that came with that. And you know, I'm going to push back on the claim that they have one of the most successful social safety nets. So I definitely think that Russia is ahead of the United States in some ways, for sure, particularly on healthcare. But at the same time, though, I mean, right now they have a new party, and it's called Pensioners for Justice, and it's a party that just got created the last year and a half because the government had to slash their Social Security program down to the point where many people, especially the elderly, just can't make it anymore. And that's because the government just doesn't have the funds to do it. It's unfortunate that has to happen. It's really sad to watch, but that's what I worry about happening here one day.
I meant to say, if I said successful, I apologize. I meant expansive.
I guess I'm not sure. You'd have to define it a bit more for me, because.
Well, I
mean, if you're living in Moscow or you're living in St. Petersburg or one of the bigger cities, yeah, you're probably going to be a little bit more comfortable. But if you're like living out in the countryside, there's not much social safety at all. I mean,
let me clarify then that what I'm speaking of is specifically in terms of the demographics of Russia. They have a policy that will, I believe, at last count, it was 10,000. They might, for some reason, 50,000 sticks in my head. That they'll give you 10 or 50,000 rubles to have a child. I'm not speaking of the entire safety net in Russia. I'll admit I don't know exactly what that is, but I do know for a fact, as an example, that one of the ways Russia has tried to combat its demographic decline is trying to financially incentivize families to have children. And one of
I'm
the
glad
ways
you.
is offering to pay you a lot of money to have children, and it's still not working.
I'm glad that you brought that up because that allowed me to go to the Italian point I wanted to make this whole time. But yeah, definitely, we don't just see that in Russia, but we also see that in Japan. They actually rolled out not only financial incentives, they were actually giving out freaking medals and awards to people if they would have kids, and it still wasn't actually giving them what the people weren't having kids. And to your point about the 50,000 rubles, I have no idea what the exchange rate is on that. Maybe if Sam wants to go to Google, I know they can do that. But no, they actually can. If you do ruble to dollar or pound to dollar, I do it all the time because I like shopping from UK stores. But I have no idea what the transfer is. But I'm just going to guess and say I don't think that the 50,000 rubles is all that much necessarily. I know that my point on America being in another Gilded Age, there are articles you can read right now where they compare Russia as experiencing something similar to the Tsarist period again. And so I think we're seeing that trend all over the world as well, where we're regressing on the social front in some ways. But in Italy, to your point about the programs that have been tried and that have not worked, like the money, the tax credit or whatever you call it for kids in Russia or Japan. In Italy, they are now beginning to try a somewhat different approach that I think it'll be interesting to see if it works or not. And it speaks specifically to the kind of highly educated high earners that you talk about who are not having kids. And that Salvini has recently put forward a proposal to introduce a tax on people who are high earners, but they're not having families. And there's also the flip side of that is these imposing a tax on migrants that is supposed to try and fund a credit for lower income people. And it'll be interesting to see how that works out.
Well, and I do think there is a connection between fertility rates and immigration and the safety net in the US, because let's be honest, you can't fund the kinds of programs to support families and incentivize having children while you've got mass immigration into a nation. There simply isn't enough money in a nation to be able to afford that kind of expense that the government undertakes.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I that's why before this conversation, before we did the podcast, I said that we would probably delve into immigration because the two are inevitably linked at the hip.
Yeah, I mean, are you guys still there?
Yep, I'm still here. I just didn't. I agreed with him generally, so I didn't really know what to say.
Okay, okay, yeah. I mean, I agreed with Gabe too. There was just kind of a drop off, and I thought maybe the internet had cut out.
I just
Um,
had a heart attack and died. Don't worry, Sam. My ghost is still here with you.
how very reassuring. Maybe you can go haunt the liberals who are harassing Trump and Antifa. No, seriously though, I do think that it's interesting that we're talking about Russia uh, giving more incentives to have children because we look at China, which is the exact opposite with their one child rule, and China is a very anti. I mean, obviously, China is an interesting case because economically they're kind of quasi-capitalist, but they're still very much communist in terms of, you know, uh, socially and morally. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they still have the one-child policy.
I think they do, but I believe that it was loosened up sometime within the last few years. I confess I've not followed Chinese domestic politics too closely.
It's
Uh,
loosened up for the rural areas.
hmm. If
Well,
I can just add in real quick, 50,000 rubles translates out to about 738 US dollars. Anyways,
but it's 50,000 rubles in Russia.
yeah, I guess, but
Don't go to the
I,
U.S. with it.
I mean, just because you have 50,000 rubles doesn't necessarily make you. I think that'd probably be pretty good money over there, $738. But in Germany, right during the Depression, it took a whole wheelbarrow full of Reichsmarks just to go buy a loaf of bread. So
True.
Yeah, I
back to
mean,
China, though. Back to China, we were talking about the one child.
well, I mean, the reason I bring up China is it's interesting, right? Because both Russia and China, I mean, Russia used to be the Soviet Union. Not too long ago, they were a communist country, very totalitarian at that. And yet they have, and this is where I get lumped into the Russia sympathizer group along with Josh. So, yay, pro Russia folks! But anyway, it's interesting how they've kind of become, more pro family, pro traditional values, things that we've traditionally seen as very Western, and yet China it seems to be doubling down even more so on the one-child policy, and especially my big gripe with feminists complaining about stuff over here. You want to go complain about women's rights, ladies? Go complain in China, where infant girls are left in dumpsters.
Well, I think I'm not going to comment too much on Chinese history because I have not studied Chinese culture, society, politics, anything near enough to even call myself a casual observer. And I don't think a lot of people have because I know that the Chinese government's been fond of saying the world needs to learn more about China and China needs to learn more about the world. But I will say, as somebody who has studied the history of communism, that the communism developed in a radically different way, both in China and Russia. Because first off, according to Marxist theory, the communist revolution was never supposed to happen in Russia in the first place, because Marx said it had to be a very agrarian, agricultural society. It couldn't have been a highly industrialized one like Russia was at the time Lenin came along. Whereas when Mao was having his revolution in China, it much more closely followed Marx's prediction. And Maoism, as it developed in China, was a little bit more from the get-go, much more totalitarian than even the Soviet system was. And I say that in particular regards to the fact that Chinese system, they actually picked a job for you. You didn't get to pick your job right from the get-go. And the way it progressed much more into the inner workings of family life than the Soviet system ever did. And the Soviet system did penetrate into family life quite a bit, but not quite to the extent of the Chinese model. So I think that plays into the reason why you see Russia being a little bit more pro-family, just because their recent history was slightly different in that regard. And it's interesting you bring that up, Sam, because I know I've seen a few articles in Russian media lately saying that they are having something of a baby boom, but we're not going to know, and I don't know how frequently censuses are done or anything like that. Maybe Gabe will know. But I don't think we'll get to see whether or not this boom that we're seeing in Russia right now in terms of people having babies, if that's going to be enough to turn around to what they need or not. I don't know when the next survey or whatever will be done, or when we're going to have numbers on these kids. But
right. I mean,
Russia's problems, I think, are geographic too.
mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, we're at a point now too where in fact, I was just reading an article about this a few weeks ago for my own podcast. Right here in America, we're at the point now where, we have baby boomers, and then we have, kind of Gen X, kind of that, I guess, bicentennial babies is what they're called, kind of like 70s and eight, like post baby boomers, but like premillennials. So 70s and 80s babies. Those are the bicentennial babies. Then we have millennials. Then we have the current, I guess Gen Z is what they're calling them, although we don't really know what to call them demographically, and we're still learning about them as a demographic in our country right now too. So, we don't really know too much about them, and it'll be interesting to see how they changed too, because right now millennials are supposedly
I
not too into having families, but then it seems like I hear that like the post millennials, let's just call them that for now, are into more traditional values.
you must be hearing different from me. Then I'm not hearing that they're anti-family values, but the studies I've seen have been depressing, and that Generation Z has an extraordinarily high suicide rate for the age that they are. And the study that I read in particular tried to, and of course, I think it's a bit of a cliche. Everybody always wants to blame the technology, but at the same time, I do think that technology can have obviously great and wonderful effects, but I also think there can be downsides as well. And the study in particular blamed technology because they pointed out that these 13, 14-year-old sort of later Gen Zs, they don't go out and hang out with their friends like I did when I was their age. They don't go out and watch movies or do the roller rink or anything like that. They much prefer to stay home and talk to their friends laying in their bedrooms on their phone, which was interesting. A lot of them do not show, the ones that are getting to around the age of being able to drive, 16, don't show much of an interest or even a desire to learn how to drive. And that one, I don't really relate to it, but I didn't get my driver's license until I was at least 16 and a half. And that's just because I was a terrible driver who failed the driving test over and over again.
I can tell you everybody in my high school wanted to drive at 16.
But this next generation,
gosh, that blew me away too.
Yeah,
but they didn't want to learn how to drive. They were much more willing to hang on and be with their parents.
right.
And it was just, to me anyway, it was striking because it tied into all these studies these articles I've read on the loneliness epidemic and the way that we've put too much priority on the individual, and that's what I related back to it. But
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, and see, again, that's the interesting thing, because we're reading two different news sources. That then again, the source I was reading is Milo, and he's trying to really target Gen Z. So obviously he's saying that they're more conservative than millennials. But even so, in regards to your comment about them not wanting to drive, that just seems so weird to me, because I'm in a situation where I can't drive because I'm in a wheelchair. But I remember, like, even at 16, like, even though I couldn't, I still wanted to drive. So
Well, and let's keep in mind the dynamic. There's a difference even among millennials and Gen Z in that, I mean, depending on how old a millennial you are,
right.
Facebook is still was relatively, well, I don't want to say new, but for a lot of us, Facebook and MySpace and those social media sites that Gen Z has grown up with, we didn't grow up with it in terms of it being in our lives at the age of 6. Facebook, I think, came out like when I was 14 or 15. So we've grown
Yeah.
up with it, but it hasn't been involved in our lives from the very formation of childhood. Whereas
Right. Yeah.
it has.
I will give a brief history of my life with technology just to maybe give our listeners an idea of how different millennials can be from Gen Z in this regard. Like Gabe said, I did not have a computer. There were computers at school, but I did not have a computer in my home until I was at least in the 6th or 7th grade. And that was when my uncle gave me one. Prior to that, I used a typewriter, and I was the only kid in my school who was typing up his homework on a typewriter. I did not have I had a cell phone, but it was a flip phone. I didn't have a smartphone until 2011. Facebook I joined in, I think, mid to late 2009, and I remember thinking how cool it was at the time. because I was able to, I'd come home and I could get on the chat thing and talk with friends because I didn't start texting until shortly before I got a smartphone. So I didn't even start texting until like 2010, 2011,
Yeah, no,
way after everybody else already had been. But I mean, you can just see already how radically different that would be from these Generation Z kids growing up now.
well, and what's interesting too is, you mentioned like people, wanting to stay in their rooms and, chat on FaceTime or whatever. Uh, the interesting thing is, I mean, I've done that too, but the other thing is like, when we're like, I've FaceTime friends, back in high school. Hey, you know, do you want to go hang out? Tonight it's a Friday, and we use technology to we use technology to chat, but but then we use it to initiate the actual like social gathering. That's the interesting thing to me is that's kind of our generation was using it. We used it to initiate the party or whatever. Now kids aren't even doing that.
I'll
So
tell you the one thing that I thought was weird about our generation. Nobody, I seem to be the last millennial on Earth. Maybe you guys agree with me, but I seemed when I was in high school to be the last millennial on Earth who would actually go to somebody's house and knock on the door. And they all thought it was weird because the normal thing was to go to somebody's house and then stand in their front yard and text them and wait for them to reply, which to me was just too damn long. But but that was the weird thing about us growing up, I thought, and I was like the one exception to that rule in my area. I would note, though, to your point, Sam, about using the technology to meet up, and this was another study I had read, and it was not just politics, but social opportunities in general, sort of. And Gabe mentioned this earlier with urban areas having more community opportunities, but if you're living in a rural area, I think the term they used was like social desert or something like that, where there was not a lot of stuff to do. I know that I have to drive, and fortunately, I don't live far away from Lincoln, but
Well,
around here. But yeah,
I mean, anecdotal, I admit to your point, Josh, but I live in Boise, Idaho. For those of you who don't know where Boise is, you'd be forgiven if you didn't. But there's a town near us that has an Air Force base. It's Mountain Home, and it's Home Air Force Base is the name of the base. But they're a town that basically their entire existence is based on the Air Force Base. And they are struggling with the fact that they're right next to Boise, which is an urban, gentrifying community with lots of opportunities for young people. And Mountain Home is basically just emptying out of people because the families that are there that have children who either are college age or high school age, whatever it may be, they're not staying. So this rural area is struggling to create the kinds of opportunities for young people to actually stay there because there's nothing to do.
I would say we sort of have we kind of have the same thing, but the opposite going on where I'm at. Because, well, mine's slightly different as well, because we also have the city of Crete, which is not near as big as Lincoln, but it is also the only place in our entire legislative district that's actually growing. But anyways, a lot of the young people around here, I've noticed, they will work and socialize in Lincoln, but then they will live in these smaller towns outside of it. And I'm not saying like a suburb because it's not close enough to be a suburb. I mean literally like it's a separate small town that's maybe 30 minutes away. And they'll live in like places like Wilbur or Milford or wherever, and then they will just drive to Lincoln to socialize or to work. So we're kind of the same dynamic, but it's opposite. Where the town's not emptying out of people, it's just that it's just becoming a place where people sleep almost. There's no community beyond that, or maybe churches.
yeah, I mean Sarasota, which is where I'm at, is kind of an interesting space because uh, 10 years ago, and keep in mind, I'm a native of Colorado, so I just recently moved here 5 years ago. But from what I've gathered from some of the local students here, there wasn't really much to do here in Sarasota up until about like I don't know 3 or 4 years ago. We've kind of started developing a downtown area for younger people to hang out, but before then, people would drive up to Tampa for the weekend and then come back here. Now, as far as Denver goes, I would love to have Adam. I wish Adam were here to comment on this. It almost seems like now with Denver, at least when I was back there, there was too much to do there, almost, if that makes sense. So,
I'm going to tell you right now, Sam. When I went to Denver for the Western Conservative Summit, I was planning my trip, and I never thought I would say this, but I was literally like, these people have too many restaurants to pick from. Where am I going to go eat?
yeah.
But no, I eventually did settle. I went to Red Square Bistro, of course, but
Good choice.
but
Yeah.
but I thought it was kind of funny, you guys, because it's my goal to try a burger, and I didn't have a burger at Red Square Bistro, I'll admit, but it's my goal to have a burger at every different restaurant I go to because I love the hamburgers and they all taste different. But I was just cracking up trying to pick one because there were so many options within such small area.
No, I mean I understand you. I look, I'm a born and bred Colorado, and yet the last two times I've gone out there, I felt like a tourist. Going to like a new city just because of the growth there. But anyway, well, not to rush anyone, but I know we all have stuff to do. So any final comments before we sign off?
I would just like to say to our listeners, if they want to hear me talk about Russia and about international relations again, to tune in on Instagram tomorrow. You can either follow at Sharova_D, or I think if you follow me at Joshua Johnson 2016, because I think she's going to patch me in on there, so it might be showing up on both of ours. But I will be doing a interview with one of their TV stations over there, and I can't pronounce the channel. But we're going to be discussing, me and some Armenian politician are going to be discussing with Daria from the Kremlin, international relations. So if you want to hear me talk more again, that'll be tomorrow at 12 Central time zone, or whatever time zone you're in. You can just use as a point of reference. It'll be at 2000 hours Moscow time. Just convert that to wherever you're at. But if you're living in the Central time zone, it'll be at 12 noon.
Which will be one on the East Coast, ladies and gentlemen. So as far as I go, folks, I know that some of you were asking for the panel's take on InfoWars, and I suppose that we could dive into that a little bit next week once Adam is back. But for those of you who are interested in my take on that, you can download this week's episode of the Whitfield Report, and I talk with Dan Sandini, a citizen journalist I've known for a long time, about censorship and social media. So download that on iTunes, and please rate and subscribe, and please, if you can, support me on Patreon as well. So those are my plugs. Gabe?
I don't have anything additional to add other than if you're a nerd like me and you want information and analysis on the 2018 midterms, just check out our blog at American Watchman. I'll be covering some of the latest election news and have lots of cool articles for y'all before now in November.
I just want to say to our listeners, if you're ever wondering why Gabe doesn't have more social media, it's because he literally is the dog in the picture, and it's kind of hard to have a smartphone if you got paws instead of fingers. But
no. Just the voice of the creature.
Yeah, that's how we fund this whole operation, folks. We have a sentient talking dog that we show off for money.
That's an amazing trick. And you'll get a bone or something. For being a.
I get a bone at the end of every podcast.
But no, that's actually Gabe's dog, Max, who I guess is begging for a walk now. So we'll let him go, and we'll talk to you guys later on the next edition of the American Watchman Roundtable. Thanks for listening and or watching, and have a great evening.